This podcast is brought to you by sarahraven.com, which is home to everything you need for a truly beautiful and productive garden. You'll also find great and essential gardening kit and stylish, lovely things to have in your house to bring the outside indoors, all inspired by the garden and the house being tied together. There's also plenty of garden inspiration, how-to videos and specialist growing guides. So head over to sarahraven.com today to discover even more. Welcome to Grow, Cook, Eat, Arrange, the podcast of me, Sarah Raven, and different guests each week, pretty much. Today, I'm joined by Adam Nicolson, my husband, and I tend to get him involved in the ones where we're talking about nature and the importance of biodiversity and those kind of subjects, I guess, because here at Perch Hill on the farm, he is in charge of that department. So I'm in charge of the garden and he's in charge of the 90-acre farm that we run here. And so today, as it's autumn and we're about to go into a massive hedge planting fiesta, we actually thought we would chat about hedges and the importance of them, because they are really important, aren't they, Adam?
So important. There was an idea at the millennium, very good idea someone had, to spend all the national lottery money on the National Hedge. Do you remember that?
I do remember that.
Fantastic scheme to make a hedge that stretched from one side of the country to another, including their own dedicated flyovers over motorways and railways.
Yes.
And you could walk the width and length of the country along the National Hedge and kind of feel the juice of England, really.
And it didn't happen, did it?
No, because everyone thought it was a ridiculous idea. And because there's no romance in government, as we know.
But there is a hedge, funny enough, over the motorway, or not the motorway, but the bypass here at Scotney Castle.
Yeah, the National Trust did a very good living bridge. They put a bypass, Lambhurst Village bypass, through the edge of Scotney Park. And everyone was in high dudgeon about it. And so they built this very, very wide, huge, God knows what the concrete carbon costs for it were, which they dug stuff out of the park, built the bridge, filled it with earth alongside the road, and put the plants back in. So now you drive under a bit of 18th century parkland.
Yeah, it is rather.
It's not really a hedge.
No, I know.
Well, although, the definition of a hedge is pretty weird. I know that I was reading the great Oliver Rackham's book about the history of the countryside the other day, and he said that in ancient documents there are things referred to as hedges that are 100 yards wide.
Wow.
Yeah. And so
That's
the idea that the hedge is a piddly little single string of this and that is not right, or doesn't need to be right. And in fact, it's better if it's not right.
Yeah.
Hedge equals thick.
Yeah, well, it definitely is a good sound buffer if you have a thicker one.
Sound, wind.
Wind,
and nature likes to hide. Birds, invertebrates, little mammals, they all like to hide.
Yeah.
And one of the great virtues of the hedge is that it's an incredible place to hide.
Yes.
And so it's like a kind of reservoir of the wild alongside that bit of ground that you're using for your garden or field or whatever. And I think that idea that it is the great refuge is really key.
Yeah.
A rich, protective refuge. So, yeah. So what should a hedge be made of then? Is that what we're going to talk about?
No, I want a little bit more on why one should have one. So the refuge thing, I remember you and I were staying on Iona in May last year. And after the Chelsea Flower Show, I was exhausted and we went to Iona for a week or so. And it's very funny, Iona. It's the most exquisitely beautiful place with white coral sands and incredible biodiversity, including whales in the sea, but also corncrakes on the island. And corncrakes are one of the rarest birds in this country and are very protected. But so there you are. And over the sand dunes, you see corncrakes quite commonly.
In the grassland.
In the grassland,
yeah.
But, But actually, weirdly, it was quite bereft of other small sort of garden and woodland birds until we walked into this area of newly planted willow, which was a bit more than a hedge. So it was more this width that you're talking about. But it was quite extraordinary, from sort of 2 meters that side to 2 meters within this hedgy sort of narrow belt of woodland. The bird and bee and butterfly and biodiversity just was 2 worlds apart. I just could not believe it. The birdsong immediately, totally times 100. And that was when I really realized that however small or large, if possible, you can plant a hedge, the better it is for your wildlife in your area and for your garden.
Well, there is this wonderful thing that the birders talk about called the warbler-y phase.
Yes.
So that you all the songbirds, and nightingales and the rest of it further south in Iona, will gather in thick young woodland. They don't like open ground. It's too frightening, too dangerous, too predators open. And they don't like big mature wood. They like this thick country. And the thing about a hedge, if you plant a hedge, you put some fast-growing things in there, and then you maintain it at its warbler-y phase, then that will ensure songbirds in your bit of ground, or your garden or whatever. And so I think that there's something very magical about that. I remember there's a great story. This is slightly off the subject, this story, but the great Earls of Pembroke, who owned slabs of Wiltshire in the 16th and 17th century, had a wonderful garden designed at Wilton, and by a Dutchman. And that was entirely surrounded by a very thick hedge. I mean, I think the hedge was about 30 feet wide and a few hundred yards long around this big garden. But what they did was that within the hedge, they built a longitudinal cage. And so they had all their gamekeepers and all the men who worked for them, hundreds and thousands of people working for the Pembrokes, go and catch all the songbirds and put them in the cage, so that as you walked around the garden, you would be absolutely surrounded by guaranteed birdsong inside the hedge.
That's rather brutal, though.
I know. It's not exactly a modern story, but it's kind of quite a beautiful idea, isn't it?
It is. So what plants, I mean, obviously this varies around the country and your soil and the environment and everything, but what would be your sort of top 5 or 6 plants to put in a hedge for biodiversity?
Well, you definitely want things that are leafy. You want things that are thorny, because it keeps other things out. The warblers like really thorny ground.
Yeah.
You want things, nectar-rich flowers, so others that have berries and fruits and seeds and nuts.
Yes.
And all of those things are actually better than, the kind of strict smart hedge.
Yes.
The hornbeam.
Yes.
I mean, we have, or the privet, but we have hawthorn hedges here. Yeah. Hawthorn, I only learned the other day, means hedge thorn. It doesn't mean with haws. It means of a hedge. It's the plant to make a hedge. Anyway, so, hawthorn, field maple, holly, and then growing up through it when things are a bit more established, ivy is an incredibly good thing because it has autumn fruits, which are in a moment when fruits are rare, or early winter fruits. Honeysuckle, but I think not immediately if you plant the hedge, because they could strangle the actual tree plants.
I mean, I think that's exactly right. Just to be technical for 1 second, is that get your hedge established for 2 to 3 years before you then put in, perhaps some blackberries, some clematis, viticella if you're on chalk, the lovely old man's beard, or, as you say, honeysuckles, etc. And ivy, of course.
Ivy has nectar in the autumn, is that right?
Yeah.
It doesn't have fruits.
Incredibly important nectar plant for September, October, and November. I mean, probably the most important nectar source in the UK for pollinators, because it's got those very open flowers. And in wasteland where there tends to be less for pollinators, there is
But only after a bit, though. There's crucially not immediately.
Yeah.
I think an ivy immediately would be dangerous for the actual trees.
So after your plant is established. So how would you recommend putting one in? I mean, we're putting in lots of hedging here this autumn, winter.
You want to put the little trees in when they're not leafy. So between November and March, but not if the ground is absolutely sodden.
Mm-hmm.
So make sure it's after a slightly drier spell and not when it's frozen, because both of those can kill the things as you put them in. And the cheapest way to do this is to get bare-rooted plants.
Yeah.
But they're very, very vulnerable to wind death. So you've got to make sure that when you're planting, you keep them in their sacking or in the shelter before they go in the ground.
Right.
So the conventional thing is to say about 3 plants per meter length in a double row.
Yeah, double row, zigzag.
So zigzag. So you get about 6 plants per meter. That is the very ordinary bog standard hedge. But I think, given this thing about thickness, that is really incredibly thin. And in fact, the hedges we've put in here, which are like that, are now rather kind of spare down at the bottom in the very place where things want to hide. So if you can afford it, I would say at least double that, at least 4 rows.
Well, it really depends, doesn't it? Because if you're an urban or a suburban garden, you can't do that. I mean, if you've got a country garden and like us, you're lucky enough to have plenty of space on a farm, then it's a very, very different story. But, even if you're doing a single row, a single hedge, you should still do the zigzag row.
Definitely. And another thing, which is very good for keeping the bottom thick, is to plant them not vertically, but at a good angle down.
Yeah.
45 degrees or even less, actually, so that laying hedges in the end, kind of, you allow them to grow very tall, and then you cut them nearly all the way through the stem at the bottom. And so you can lay the stem down, but it's still getting the juice from the roots through the bit of bark that you've left on the thing. But you end up laying them at an angle that is probably 30 degrees to the ground.
Yeah.
And if you plant them like that, then you are guaranteeing a kind of deep thickness down there. It's a very good idea.
I mean, the takeout from all of this, I mean, we're not finishing yet, but is, to me, really highlighted in a story of this last weekend. We were down in Dorset and some friends found a hedgehog wound up in fencing wire that had been planted around, the edge of somebody's garden. And, you don't have to have rolling acres to have a hedge. I mean, it's just rather than a fencing panel or worse, a wire fence, think of a hedge and just keep it well clipped. And it is unbelievable. I mean, we haven't even said about birds and nesting. Perhaps we'll come on to that. So if you want to encourage and be nice and friendly to the birds, how should you maintain your hedge? When should you cut it all those kind of things?
Well, I think you have to have a good mix. You don't want the single species. And so hawthorn, these lovely spiky things, hawthorn, blackthorn, but I know that blackthorn does tend to spread out. But it makes a wonderful, the nightingales that we've had here have all been nesting in blackthorn thickets. And I have been trampling down blackthorn thickets in the winter to make them even more thickety. But you can then add into that field maple, holly, dog rose. We actually, outside our bathroom here, as you know, have an olive tree. And the olive tree, nearly every morning at the moment, has little chiff-chaffs in it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And so I know people love the idea of native, but I am a massive Europhile. And I think get an olive in there and you never know what might turn up. So anyway, plant in the winter.
Yeah.
Not the frozen winter, not the sodden winter. And then maybe in the spring, when things are sprouting, trim them rather counterintuitively. You think you want to let these things roar away, but actually you want the juice to go into the root. And so, in fact, trimming early keeps a hedge thick and allow them to then just grow on. And you don't want to, if you have a certain length of hedge, you don't want to cut it all at once.
Yeah.
So some years you might cut a bit, and other years you would cut those other bits.
Okay.
And you don't want to cut when they're nesting. So you don't want to cut from March to September, August, say. And you don't want to cut in the early winter because that's when the berries and fruits are there. So actually there's a very narrow window for trimming a hedge, and it will be January, February.
Okay, that's good to know.
When basically things have been eaten and it hasn't yet started they haven't started to nest in it yet. So, I mean, it's quite a nice, as ever we've gone, it has quite a nice annual rhythm to it. They just trim it down, but don't brutalize it. Make sure there's some protection left in there. And the thing should turn into a kind of thick living basket.
Yeah. A mini living wall, basically, or it can be mini or it can be massive.
Yeah, but also kind of with a lovely, if you ever poke into the middle of a hedge, you often find a nest in there. It has this amazing internal landscape. Little wrens, for example, might hardly ever emerge from the hedge.
Yeah.
The wrens are the commonest birds in England, but you never see them, do you?
That's true.
They're all hiding in the hedges.
That's true, and even bullfinches here. I know we have some that very much live in the hedges, and they are incredibly shy. So it really allows the whole thing of not just the pollinators on the hawthorn, etc., apple blossom, but also, of course, critical for birds.
There's one other thing which is incredibly important for establishing the hedge is that you've got to make sure that it's not the grasses around the feet of the plants are not competing with it.
Very key.
Because amazingly, grasses can kill hedge plants. And so either you can weed them, or you can mulch them very heavily, or you can use some kind of artificial mulch, which you can, which is in some ways reusable, I think.
Yeah. A membrane mulch.
A membrane mulch, yeah.
Good. Anything else before we finish on hedges?
I mean, if it were down to me, I would dedicate an entire section of garden to an enormous square hedge.
Yeah, well, it's a wood then, isn't it?
It's a controlled, contained, warbler-y phase wood.
Yeah, it's a copse.
It's a wood that you just keep alive. It isn't stretching away in a mad, sort of tall way that will annoy the neighbours, but just become this kind of living basket.
Yeah. Thanks so much for listening to Grow Cookie to Range. And next week, I'm joined by Jemima Bowker, who is giving advice for people who are just starting out and have perhaps small urban spaces. So join me then. You can find more information, photos and advice sheets on all the plants and recipes we talk about on this podcast by heading to the show notes or at sarahraven.com/podcast.